Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Gregory Wilpert, joining you from Quito, Ecuador. Recently elected French President Emmanuel Macron is on course for historic gains. His fledgling party, Republic on the Move, is set to trounce the traditional opposition in the parliamentary election following last Sunday's first-round vote. Pollsters predict the party and its center-right ally, Modem, could win as many as 3/4 of the seats in the lower house after the June 18 runoff, meaning that Macron's pro-business reforms are almost guaranteed to go through. Macron's party is more than 10 points ahead of its nearest challengers, the Conservative Republican Party and its allies. Marine Le Pen's far-right National Front Party is facing its second big defeat in a month, projected to win just a small handful of seats, perhaps as few as one. But it was the Socialist Party that suffered the most. The former ruling party is set to win just 30 to 40 seats. Leftist candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who won nearly 20% of the presidential race, said that Macron's victory is no mandate because only 1 in 2 voters turned out to vote in Sunday's first round. That's a record low turnout. Joining us now from Washington, D.C. to analyze the results is Alex Main. Alex is senior researcher at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Thanks, Alex, for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you, Greg.
So clearly the voters who supported either the leftist candidate Mélenchon or the right-wing candidate Marine Le Pen stayed home on Sunday. Their parties practically collapsed under the record-high abstention. How do you explain that? Why was there such a low turnout?
Well, I mean, I don't think they all stayed home. Obviously, Mélenchon and his party, France Insoumise, didn't do too badly. They got 11% of the vote, and the Front National got over 13% of the vote. Of course, that's nowhere near what Marine Le Pen, the presidential candidate for Front National, received in the first round of the presidential elections, where she got, I think, around 22%, well, a little bit less than that, around 21%. But I mean, what we saw play out is what does generally play out in French legislative elections of the last few elections, and I can explain briefly why it's only for the last few. But what we see is that there is a high rate of mobilization around the presidential elections, and then those that are mobilized for the legislative elections are really the voter base for the winner of the presidential elections, and also to a certain extent the sort of next up. And that's what we saw in these elections. But you're right that the level of abstention is incredibly high. In fact, it's a record for France under the Fifth Republic. The Fifth Republic, of course, has been around since 1958. In previous elections, abstention had been sinking and sinking, but it never quite reached this, or rather, I should say, abstention had been rising and rising, but it never quite reached this level. And I think part of the reason for that is that, indeed, there isn't a lot of enthusiasm for the winner of the presidential elections, Emmanuel Macron. We've got to remember that he got 24% in the first round of the elections, and he, really gathered a lot of votes in the second round merely because a great deal of the French electorate wanted to vote against the far-right candidate, Marine Le Pen. So I think, he didn't have an extraordinary base, and he certainly doesn't have one now, but he is really someone who's very good at taking advantage of the circumstances. And he, I think, was very clever in the way he bailed out of the French Socialist Party towards the end of François Hollande's disastrous presidential term. François Hollande, one of the most unpopular presidents in sort of contemporary French history, and having any association with him would be a killer in any elections. Of course, Macron did have an association as he was minister under François Hollande.
Well, that's
But
something actually I just want to get to is the question of, well, I mean, as a minister, he already proposed various neoliberal reforms that didn't go through. And so now he's promising again, basically, to reissue these labor law reforms and things like that in the National Assembly, basically a neoliberal agenda. Tell us a little bit about what he did back then and what he's planning now.
well, I mean, that's really the great irony because it is these sorts of reforms that were, pushed by François Hollande's government and by Macron himself when he was in the government that were extraordinarily unpopular and that sort of led to, the sort of disastrous ratings that the Hollande government got. And yet Macron has managed to position himself as kind of an anti-systemic um, sort of candidate, and his party, it's all a bunch of fresh candidates. Most people don't really know who they are, but I think, we're at a particular juncture in kind of French politics and its society um, where there's a real craving for some alternative to the traditional parties. And the traditional parties, of course, of the last few decades have been some version of the Gaullist parties. Now it's the Républicain and the Socialist Party. They are wildly unpopular at the moment. And I think, a lot of French voters were just wanting to vote for someone who appeared to represent something very different and someone who would kind of break with uh, France's traditional politics. Obviously, a phenomenon that we've seen in all parts of the world, really, certainly in the U.S. and in Western Europe, and part of the response of the electorate to the devastating economic crisis since 2008, 2009, that of course has really set in much more strongly in Europe than it has in the U.S.
So, but Mélenchon already has warned Macron not to pursue his agenda because of the low turnout, saying that he basically doesn't have a mandate. And as I mentioned earlier, both Macron's predecessors, Nicolas Sarkozy and François Hollande, also tried to push through these neoliberal reforms. And presumably, voters might be in for a surprise once Macron tries to pursue the same agenda, for a third time, basically. What do you expect to happen this time around?
Well, he may not have much of a mandate, and Mélenchon certainly has a point. Really, when you count up the votes that Macron's party received in these elections, it only amounts to about 15% of registered voters in France. So, yes, absolutely not much of a mandate. However, it doesn't really matter in terms of French institutions because he will almost certainly have a very strong majority in the French National Assembly, which will allow him to, push forward his agenda, and he seems very keen on doing so. And it's not really the same case as François Hollande. When he came in, he promised, I wouldn't say an outright anti-neoliberal sort of agenda, but he certainly promised to reverse some of the neoliberal reforms of the previous government, of the Sarkozy government, and he did the opposite. He essentially deepened some of these reforms, and he would have gone much further had the French not protested as strongly as they did. And I think that's what Mélenchon is counting on in this case. Obviously, nothing can be achieved in the National Assembly. Mélenchon's party, in the best case scenario, will have 14 or 15 members of the parliament out of 577. So I don't think he can do much there. But I think we have seen in the past, certainly when French governments have tried to push through these reforms, very intense mobilization in the streets of France, massive strikes, and so on. And I think that's very likely to happen again, and it's really not clear how Macron will sort of respond to that. Will he respond by just forging ahead no matter what and perhaps relying on a lot of repression? That wouldn't be entirely surprising. I mean, we saw some of that already occurring under the Hollande government, and it could continue to occur under Macron. It's not clear how he'll deal with it, but I think he will almost certainly have to deal with it, because he has been very open about the reforms he wants to carry out, notably to render the labor market much more flexible, pension reform, and so on, and maintaining sort of the line on these austerity policies. In fact, going further than he needs to in terms of the austerity policies that are sort of required of France under the European Stabilization Pact. So, I expect we'll see a lot of unrest. I expect he'll want to carry forth with his reforms no matter what.
I just want to finally turn quickly to the issue of the French left. It looks like one of the reasons the left fared so badly was because it was quite divided. Not only do you have remnants of Hollande's Socialist Party, but Mélenchon's party, Anbouwd France, or France Insoumise, refused to make any alliances with other left parties, such as the Communists, or even with his former party, the Left Party. What do you think happened? Why are they so divided?
Well, I mean, I think there are mutual suspicions between the Communist Party and Mélenchon and his party, the France Insoumise, and I think they are warranted on both sides. I think each has sort of tried to take advantage of the other, and has no intention of sort of merging in any way, and the Communist Party is understandably very, very concerned with their receding voter base. And I mean, this is, very clear in these latest elections, where I believe the Communist Party received somewhere between 3 and 4% only of the vote. I mean, these are real historic lows for the Communist Party. Whereas this newcomer, Mélenchon, has clearly received votes from, both former Socialist Party voters and from Communist Party voters. So he's benefited from both. He is the one who's benefited the most. And in terms of, his trying to build a party independently of the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, he has had a certain amount of success despite the rather low turnout of his voter base in these elections. I mean, I think the question is whether he's going to be able to maintain it. He's going to have only a small handful of allies in the Congress, and certainly it is disappointing to see, particularly when you take into account that in the first round of the presidential elections, it was very clear that what can be considered to be the sort of hard left in France, Communist Party, Mélenchon's party, the France Insoumise, but also the left of the Socialist Party, which was represented by Benoît Hamon. If you rounded up all those votes, it was over 25% of the electorate. And in fact, if they'd had one candidate in that first round, that candidate would have been the front runner ahead of Emmanuel Macron or Marine Le Pen. So very disappointing that we're not seeing more unity on the left. And I'm not very optimistic that it's going to get much better anytime soon. And it is, I think, a wasted opportunity.
Okay, well, we're going to keep an eye on the continuing developments, especially after the second round of the vote and then what Macron plans to do. So we were talking to Alex Main, senior researcher at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Thank you for your time, Alex.
Thanks, Greg.
And thank you for watching and supporting the Real News Network.